I want to start out today by just saying a few words relating to the question of inevitability, which was the question asked in the midterm examination, whether the rise of the West was inevitable, and if so, from what point. The first point I make is that the question assumes that the West exists as an entity. During most of the time period that was suggested, that is, say, period from 1500 down to 1900, you would have had a very difficult time finding anyone who knew what the West was. They would have thought France is on the rise, or Britain is on the rise, or Spain is on the rise, but they wouldn't have aggregated all of these things together, particularly including North America, as the West. This may not seem entirely logical, because we have been taught now to recognize that the Orient is the other of the West. But in some respects, the Orient was created before the West existed, which is could be a problem if anybody wanted to pursue it very far. In other words, we had an Orient that was thought of as being other than something, but it was more normally thought as being other than, say, the Christian world, or other than Europe, or other than a particular country, but the notion of the West as a broad category. The closest thing you would get to it would be a concept like Christendom. And yet, if you pose the question, was the rise of Christendom inevitable after 1500? Well, probably that would be a very difficult question for anybody to undertake, because we've now taken West to be a real entity. And in some respects, this is a presumption that is at the very root of the contemporary history teaching of world history, because the first really influential book on world history was William McNeill's The Rise of the West. And by the time people were reading that book and were impressed by the book, the West had come into being. And interestingly, the East, by that time, was not the Orient. It was the communist empire. So that the rise of the West was not, if you talk about East-West politics in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, you're not talking about the West versus the Orient. You're talking about Europe, and talking about NATO against the Warsaw Pact. So there are real difficulties with the whole notion of the inevitability of the rise of the West, because of the assumption it makes about the word West, even leaving aside the question of what in the world inevitable means. Okay, that's the first observation I make. The second observation I would make is that if I had asked the question, is the rise of China inevitable? That would have been, I think, a very difficult question for people to address, because there the word inevitable would have a predictive aspect to it. So one of the things about the rise of the West being inevitable is that it is strictly retrospective. Say, okay, we know what happened, hence let us evaluate in some fashion why it happened and how it might have happened differently. But say with the rise of China, is it inevitable? In terms of the arguments made in the the book referred to in the midterm. That is to say, are there or have there been moments when the rise of China could be derailed, or the baby strangled in its cradle, I think was the image that used in the quote. Well, when it's something ongoing, you could say, well, yeah, I mean, supposing during the Korean War the United States had followed the advice of General MacArthur and used the atomic bomb against the People's Republic of China, and there had been a nuclear war that had devastated China. Would that have prevented China from rising in the second half of the 21st century, which those who look at China now feel is kind of the likelihood? If Mao had been assassinated in 1948 instead of leading the Communist Party to power, would a nationalist party leading China in the post-World War II era have come to the same kind of path that China has come to now? And I think you can hypothesize these things and quite easily say, well, sure, something could have happened. It hasn't, but it may still. One doesn't know. Ongoing historical processes are much more difficult to assess than ones that appear to have passed. But that's always an appearance, because the historian is the one who's deciding what it is to look at. And there are always other optics that can be used, other ways of looking at what is going on. In the period since World War II, we have given, and probably for some time will continue to give, singular prominence to the Cold War. And people who are old enough to have lived through that period will think that it's hard. How could you not do that? But the question of whether the Cold War needs to be at the center of things, particularly now that it's 20 years in the past, and indeed you might even say 30 years since it was winding down before the final fall of the Soviet Union, or the dissolution of the Soviet Union. How long are we going to continue to say that that is the great story of the post-war era? And this is a problem that you have in historical structuring. And I mention this in part because when you embark on the final examination, I've asked you to write the first 200 words of a final chapter, which will be post-1991. Those 200 words can be, and indeed maybe should be, a kind of philosophical run-up to the year 1991, in which you can say, well, this is the end of something. But you can also say that actually new things began before that, and I'm now going to highlight those things that are continuing. The year 1991 happens to be the year that the authors of The Earth and Its People chose as a dividing point. But it's not a necessary turning point. And indeed, we had a huge argument among the authors about whether there was any date prior to 1991 and subsequent to 1945 that seemed to be a watershed year. And of course, one of the problems of 1991 is going to be 2001, which is the year of 9/11, and the question of whether that is a watershed year. So anyway, these are are constructions. So the Cold War is in many ways a kind of construct. Certainly had enormous political and intellectual force behind it. As it turned out, it did not lead to a nuclear war, and the wars that were fought in the context of the Cold War never reached the scale that had been anticipated, in the late 1940s. It reminds me, in a way, of one of the great structural concepts of the 19th century, which was entertained by British politicians and thinkers, in which they talked about protecting the route to India, and how India was so important to the wealth of Great Britain that all sorts of strategies should be resorted to protect the route to India. Countries were conquered, or peoples were conquered. Protectorates were established. Institutions were put in place, not least of which, of course, finally the governmental takeover of rule in India in the 19th century by the British government. And yet, you look back now and you say, well, was the route to India ever threatened? Or was this something imaginary? Or not imaginary, at least, let's say, exceptionally low probability. People go back and they say, well, Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798 and hoped to conquer the Middle East and then march overland and attack the British in India. Well, come on. That's a long, long way. And it's true that Alexander the Great got to India, marching across that territory and defeating everyone he came in contact with. But even when he got to India, his troops were so tired and exasperated and so forth that they wouldn't let him go any farther. But Napoleon's threat to India was taken seriously. So you had to protect the route to India because the French might get there. Or in what was called the Great Game, the Russians might cross Central Asia and get there. How would they do that? They would conquer the Muslim khanates of Central Asia. Then they would simply trip across Afghanistan and then confront the British in India. Well, tripping across Afghanistan is really, really, really hard. The likelihood that anybody was going to invade British India from the north or from the northwest across Afghanistan, in retrospect, seems preposterous. Afghanistan is not easy. And of course, when the Russians finally did invade Afghanistan, they got their clocks cleaned and they had to withdraw. And so we went in, and the clockwork is being scrubbed at the moment. There was no difficulty in imagining these things. So in imagining the Cold War, the idea that there was a Soviet colossus that was going to conquer everything if they were not stopped at every possible opportunity was something of an illusion. Underlying it was the concept of nuclear war, and the question still continues to this day as to whether nuclear war was ever very likely during the Cold War. I know that when we write a history book such as the one we have before us, we think of the Cuban Missile Crisis as a place where the world came to the brink of nuclear war. I doubt it. Nuclear war was something that was so suicidal, given the scale of the arsenals on either side, that I find it literally unbelievable that you would have had the political leadership of either side saying, let's do it. We create a image of this. Dr. Strangelove, of course, is the classic American statement of it, with Slim Pickens riding a bomb down, with his cowboy hat on. But realistically, nuclear war was unthinkable. As Herman Kahn wrote in his book, Thinking About the Unthinkable, it really was something that the people who were most involved and most responsible knew how unthinkable a nuclear war was. The general public was encouraged to be much more fearful. It supported the political myths on both sides. And creating these myths, it can be very valuable. In other words, the myth of protecting the route to India gave Britain an empire. Not all parts of it, but some parts of it. Britain took over territories because there was an off chance that there would be a threat to the road to India. Look at how Britain established itself in the Persian Gulf area, for example. The Cold War probably was necessary as a myth in order to facilitate the ascendancy of the United States, not the ascendancy of the Soviet Union.
Wasn't containment the grand strategy of the United States for 50 years?
Containment was a grand strategy, but containment, of course, assumes that the other side is expanding. Well, that is something that can be debated. One of the great debates of the Cold War era was the debate over whether the Communist Party of Vietnam was a tool of worldwide communist expansion. Ho Chi Minh was certainly an agent of international communism in his personal history, but whether the Vietnamese ever intended to be subservient to Soviet leadership when they finally won the war, they actually maintained a rather independent posture, particularly falling into quarrels with China. And today, the old communist side that won the war in Vietnam does not appear to have much residue of that notion, because the question was, if you have containment, what is it you're trying to contain? If the British are protecting the route to India, who are they protecting it from? The assumption was that the French or the Russians or somebody else wanted to attack India. You can go back to the Roman period and how the Roman Empire grew. And I've mentioned this before, that Rome grew by defending itself, because the wars that it fought were wars of defense. You had a type of priest, a fetial or a fetial, however you want to pronounce it, and you actually had a college of these priests, and they were the ones who advised the Roman government on diplomacy and matters of war. If Rome had a grievance with someone, the leader of the Fetiales, who had the title of Pater Patratus, he was supposed to go to the border with the offending state and shout across the border the demands of the Romans. Then he was supposed to physically cross the border, and the first man he came to, he was supposed to tell him what it was that the Romans demanded to resolve the dispute. Then he was supposed to proceed on to the forum of that place. And in the forum, he was supposed to announce an ultimatum that either you satisfy the grievance that we have, or you risk a war. Then he would return to Rome, and there would be a passage of 33 days. During those 33 days, the other side had a chance to amend its bad behavior, whatever the bad behavior happened to be. But in other words, there was no state of war existing. It's just that the Romans had decided they had some neighbor who was threatening or who had behaved badly. After 33 days, if the Roman government decided that there would be a war, then the head of the Fetiales would go to the frontier, and he would take a javelin with blood on its tip and throw it across the frontier while yelling, essentially, "Time's up." And then he would come back to Rome, and then there would be a war. But interestingly, the wars that were fought in this way, which was the dominant form of Rome going to war for in the earliest period, the wars were not fought in the name of the god of war. It was not Mars who was the god of war under whose aegis the Roman armies would march forth. It was either Jupiter or Juno or some other god, because it wasn't a war, it was a defense that was blessed by the gods. And being blessed by the gods was essential. And I think about that and how Rome, in the model of defending itself, ended up with a larger and larger and larger state, just as the British defending the route to India ended up with a larger empire. And I think of how the United States uses United Nations as a collegium of priests to bless wars. I mean, you think about this, and how for the United States to initiate a war without, or warlike action, without the blessing of the United Nations is very, very uncomfortable for Americans. We want to have right on our side, and the right in the post-World War II period has been whatever the international collectivity has been that is relevant. Either the United Nations Security Council or NATO or the coalition of the willing, made up of many states around the world. But the idea that the United States would go to war all by itself is something that's unattractive, because then it doesn't appear to be necessarily to be just. It appears to be capricious or elective or non-sanctioned by some sort of larger concept. Why did the United States move along this route after 1945? After World War I, what was striking was that the United States became isolationist. It had sent troops to Europe, had taken substantial losses, had had a president, Woodrow Wilson, who'd involved himself as an internationalist in the peace process. The United States as a country at that point had large numbers of citizens living abroad and concerning themselves with the affairs of local people in the capacity of missionaries, particularly in non-Western areas like China or India or the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire. And yet the country as a whole stepped back and said, no, we don't want to be involved with the world. At the end of World War II, the U.S. decided it wanted to be involved with the world. Had the United States become powerfully opposed to Bolshevism and communism at the end of World War II? Well, Russia, of course, had been our ally during World War II, and we had shipped massive amounts of armaments to Russia in order to support their war against Germany. Whereas at the end of World War I, the United States was intensely anti-Bolshevik. The hatred of Bolshevism, fear of Bolshevism, was stronger at the end of World War I than it was in many respects at the end of World War II. I may have mentioned before a book by Upton Sinclair called Goose Step, which is a portrayal of American higher education in the 1920s, and where he goes from one university campus to another to talk about what is the character of these universities, what is being taught, so forth and so on. Upton Sinclair was a socialist. And what he found across the country, again and again and again, was that intellectuals, faculty members who supported Bolshevism or socialism, or who knew somebody who did support Bolshevism or socialism, or who were suspected of having these tendencies, they lost their jobs because there was such an intense fear of this thing. The Red Scare of that period was very powerful, and yet it did not stimulate the United States trying to do anything about the new Soviet state. And in fact, in the 1920s, many American businesses supported economic development in the Soviet Union. So, but when you come to the end of World War II, and normally you write this narrative and you say there was a refusal of the Soviets to remove their troops from northwestern Iran, and this was a crisis. Ultimately, a crisis resolved by Iranian diplomacy, and the Soviets withdrew. And then you had the Iron Curtain, the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe. The idea that there might have been an American takeover of Western Europe never gets into the picture. It's the Soviets are the ones who are expanding. And then you have the Korean War. And the Korean War, in which Russia was not involved directly, becomes the proof that that expansive communism must be fought in military terms. It didn't have to happen that way. When the Soviet Union obtained an atomic bomb and then a hydrogen bomb, it wasn't necessary to assume that they intended to use them. There are reasons to build weapons that are not predicated primarily on the presumption that they will be used in some specific or near-term situation. If you look at, say, the history of dreadnoughts, of super battleships that drew down huge proportions of the military budgets of Britain and France and Germany and other countries, Japan, in the early 20th century, you find that competition in and of itself can explain a lot of armament without necessarily an assumption that those arms have a logical use or a even a strong will to use them. You take the German high seas fleet during World War I never fought a battle because they thought if they were defeated, that would be terrible, so it's better not to fight because a fleet in being is better than a fleet at the bottom of the ocean. So they spent all the money on these super dreadnoughts that never fired a shot during the course of the war. So we look back and we say, well, if the Soviet Union has gotten the bomb, and let's assume that there were spies that helped them get the bomb. Well, so there were spies, and they helped them get the bomb. Now they have the bomb. What exactly were they going to do with the bomb? Was there an intent to obliterate the United States by nuclear war? Or was this a defensive position taken by the Soviet Union in view of its own staggering losses during World War II? Now, you can argue the American side of this, or you can argue the Soviet side of this, and not come to a fixed conclusion, because there's no way of proving that these weapons never would have been used. But when you constructed all this in the abstract, you saw it as a bipolar world with one great power facing another great power, and with a somewhat weak effort by non-Western, non-Eastern powers to create a third world presence or a third world alliance. One of the reasons I'm mentioning this is because we're currently going through an interesting period where India has become a nuclear power. Pakistan has become a nuclear power. Iran may become a nuclear power. Israel is assumed to be a nuclear power. And there is a question as to whether these things intrinsically mean that we are near nuclear war. Now, when it was us and the Soviet Union, both sides were convinced that nuclear war could happen by accident, because of what happened in Cuba or how it happened in Berlin or what would happen in Turkey or something like that. Now, if you asked people, what do you think is the probability of a nuclear war between Pakistan and China, Pakistan and India, over the next 50 years? I think you would find a very different appraisal of the significance of those nuclear weapons than if you asked that question of what was the probability of a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States in the 1960s or the 1970s. There is a question of what is the probability of a nuclear war between Iran and Israel. That is, of course, the most pressing issue in some circles at the present time. There are people who believe that unless there are preemptive measures taken, that it is inevitable that Iran will initiate a nuclear war against Israel, and therefore it is essential that those preemptive measures be taken, either by Israel unilaterally or the United States unilaterally or with Israel, or by the international community more broadly. That's one school of thought. There's another school of thought that maintains that the likelihood of Iran initiating a war against Israel hovers so close to zero as to be a matter of no consequence in international affairs. First of all, because Iran doesn't have any nuclear weapons. Second of all, because Israel has lots of nuclear weapons and could respond to an attack by Iran in a devastating fashion, with or without American help. Thirdly, because the rationale for such a war is, let's say, sketchy at best. It's pointed out again and again that the president of Iran has declared that at some point Israel should disappear or will disappear from the map, and that the Holocaust did not occur in the way that Israel and her friends claim. And his words are taken to be the sign of a, let's say, Holocaust intent. People who maintain this argument are inclined to think that whatever the president of Iran says must be the position of Iran, even though in virtually every other juncture it is observed that the president of Iran is not a free agent and is under the aegis of a supreme guide who has not said the things that the president of Iran has said, and in fact has said Iran will never acquire a nuclear weapon. So we don't know who has the authority to do what. But part of the problem here is that there is an assumption that is made by some people that the concept of mutually assured destruction, which was the philosophy that gained power during the Cold War as a way of summarizing the nuclear balance or the nuclear standoff or the nuclear stalemate between the Soviet Union and the United States, in order to think about an Iranian attack on Israel, one has to assume that the concept of mutually assured destruction no longer has any meaning. And that mutual, two sides. That the assumption has to be, oh, I see what you mean, that the Iranians are willing to commit suicide and see their entire country destroyed simply in order to launch a weapon against Israel that might or might not work. Now, interestingly, throughout the entire history of the Cold War, the idea that nuclear war would come about because of suicidal insanity on the part of one side or the other was discounted. People said, no, it is so awful, so unspeakable, that it's impossible to imagine a head of government initiating a nuclear war that is going to result in the total devastation of his own country. But in the current debate, that assumption is being set aside on the grounds that Iran is not a normal country. It is a country of Jew-hating fanatics who will all go to paradise happily if there is the possibility of destroying Israel. This is in the eyes of some people, this is a fantasy. In the eyes of other people, this is a certainty. But what interests me in this is that what we assumed throughout the Cold War was that rationality was ultimately related to what was going on, even though the preposterous levels of overkill that the two sides achieved were so enormous that the risk wasn't of losing a war and having your state devastated, but rather having the whole planet devastated. A sort of, game over sort of scenarios. And now all of that logic is being sort of set aside in some quarters in order to produce a different logic, which is that a fanaticism of sufficient intensity will overrule all logic. Now, to me, this seems to be an effort to extend the intellectual construct, the myth of the Cold War, into the post-Cold War period, to create a concept of nuclear holocaust and nuclear standoff that's ideologically driven, that will be a continuation and that of what we had in the Cold War. And that essentially it's an effort to create a power in the world, or to assert that there is a power in the world that is substituting for the old communist menace of the we had before the 1990s. What is the value of having the world conceived of in terms of a violent bipolarity? Some people would argue that bipolarity, having maximum threats of one side against another, Israel and America in this case against Iran and a billion fanatic Muslims around the world, that the value of this is that it is a powerful structuring concept for economics, for strategy, for military procurement, for placement of military assets, et cetera, et cetera. And that in the absence of a bipolar world, you get potential chaos, because every country will have its own interest instead of having the American interest versus, whoever the adversary is. So what we found in the 1990s was that you had many people who were trying to create an alternative to the Soviet Union as the enemy of the United States. And as time has gone on, that alternative has fluctuated some, but it's primarily either the Muslim world or in a more far-fetched fashion, China. It's interesting, China has a huge arsenal. America has a huge arsenal. China is competing for dominance in the world's economic sphere. The United States is competing for dominance in the world economic sphere. China is developing relations with countries in Central Asia, Africa, acquiring raw materials. The United States, acquires raw materials abroad, develops, and yet nobody is saying that there's a Cold War between China and the United States. It's not quite clear why. Instead, we're focused on Iran, which is frankly, a pretty weak and chaotic and hopeless state. Now, more dangerous? Well, that's what big guys say about little guys all the time. Now, I think part of it is that at the end of World War II, Americans and Western thinkers as a whole began to think in global terms in a way that they never had before. when you look at the big thinkers of the 19th century or the 18th century. Well, the 18th century, you can see some inputs from abroad in terms of, say Montesquieu's Persian letters or something like that. But by the 19th century, the big thinkers in Europe thought of the non-European world as an area of imperial expansion. And their thoughts were primarily about themselves and about how they had developed, how they were developing, where they're going to go, so forth and so on. Marx wrote about Europe and then created something called the Oriental mode of production in order to explain the rest of the world. The rest of the world becoming sort of a residual category once you'd talked about the really interesting stuff, which is European. What happens after World War II is that people in the West, in particular, begin to think that they have to understand the entire world and to act in the entire world. They also became convinced, or convinced themselves, that they could understand the entire world. I look back and I think this is really very peculiar. The knowledge about areas outside of Europe and North America that was accessible to policymakers and intellectuals in the in the 1950s and 1960s was extremely thin. We knew very little about China, very little about India, very little about the Middle East, a little bit more about Latin America, virtually nothing about Africa. And yet, American intellectuals in academia in the 50s and 60s prided themselves on coming up with theories that explained the entire world. And they would usually ground those theories by going back and seeing what people thought about in the 19th century, in the 18th century. Say, well, let's start with Thomas Hobbes. And where does that get us? Because after all, Thomas Hobbes must have understood the entire world when he said that that primal man lived in a state of the war of all against all. Why would we think that Hobbes would know that? Why would we think that Adam Smith understood the nature of economic phenomena categorically? But everyone can look back and see limitations on these earlier thinkers, but they provide the sort of bedrock ideas that then, in the post-World War II period, turn into bedrock ideas for thinking of the world as a whole in the post-World War II period. As I say, this was particularly an American phenomenon, and it was institutionalized in the form of area studies, in which we expected Americans to study foreign areas for 2 or 3 years, and then grasp the total nature of the society. This couldn't be done. I tried it. And this was what my whole career was bent on doing. I was supposed to study the Middle East, and I had the advantage of starting my sophomore year in college. And I got a BA. Two-thirds of all my college courses dealt with the Middle East. And then 2 years of graduate school, and I had a master's degree in Middle East Studies. And 3 more years, and I had a PhD in History and Middle East Studies. And what I knew about the Middle East really wasn't very much. It was really pretty thin gruel, but it was an awful lot better than the people who had just gotten that 2-year MA, who were then going into government and becoming ambassadors and planning on wars and things like that. It wasn't very much, partly because there wasn't much available to learn from. In 1960, it was possible to read everything that came out in English dealing with Islam and the Middle East on a regular basis. You could read everything. Another month, there are 3 more issues of this journal and that journal. You can go through, read the articles, and you can catch up on everything. You had one encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia of Islam. You could read it. It was still coming out. And I would get my fascicle of the Encyclopedia of Islam, and I would read through it. So you could end up getting vast amounts of information, but it was information about 30 countries, half a dozen language areas, 2,000 years of time. It was just, incomprehensible how anyone would expect you to have real knowledge. But the people who were producing the big ideas of that period knew far less than I did, because they were assuming that they had a unique capacity to understand everything that was happening in the world. This is, I referred to it in the last lecture as hubris, and it truly was. I do not disparage the people who came up with the big ideas at that time, because at the level of generality at which we were trying to learn things about foreign areas, it was very important to have big structuring wrong ideas, or big structuring ideas, all of which proved to be wrong, because you needed something to hold things together. Like you had to think, Arabs are X, Chinese are Y. Indians come in 2 flavors, Muslims and Hindus. Africans, let's not even talk about them. So you had general works by sociologists, by political scientists, by historians, by anthropologists that were explaining the entire world. Nothing like that occurred after World War I. The US had no interest in the entire world. But after World War II, suddenly the entire world was a matter of intense interest, and we would try to institutionalize the study of it so that we could understand it. It's just that the basis for that understanding was so weak that the understanding almost by definition had to be wrong. And it was. There were profound oversights and mistakes and so forth. In the area that I'm most concerned about, it was very striking that between the end of World War II and the Iranian Revolution of 1979, there were only 3 books written by American academics dealing with Islam in the contemporary world. There were lots of books dealing with Muhammad and medieval Islam, but nobody was writing about contemporary Islam. One ex-CIA person wrote a book on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, another person wrote on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and a third person wrote about Egypt. But outside of Egypt, nobody was writing about Islam. The reason was that we had a huge idea saying that traditional society, which you can gloss as saying religiously oriented society, is obsolete and will pass away or become entirely privatized in an emotional and intellectual sense. And therefore, religion is of no importance. Of course, this is an extension of 19th century thinking about Christianity in Europe, or about Judaism. among people who had left the Orthodox outlook behind. The assumption was that the world will evolve going forward in the way that Europe has evolved up to that point. That just as Europe becomes post-Christian, the rest of the world will become post-Hindu, post-Buddhist, post-Muslim, post-everything, because religion no longer counts for anything. Leave aside the previous several thousand years because it's now been all changed. Religion wasn't supposed to count for anything, and therefore we weren't supposed to know anything about it, because there's no need to know anything about it. So we were in this ironic situation where we were training people to go to the Islamic world and study economic and political development, or tribal structure, or urban development, natural resource management, so on. And we didn't have any young scholar who went off and asked of the people who were in his own age cohort in these Muslim countries what they were reading. So you had a potent, neo-Muslim ideologue, the most potent one in many respects. Sayyid Qutb, who was writing in favor of revolution, in favor of violent activity by Muslims against the West, and who had been to the United States and spent time in the United States and had an excoriating critique, right or wrong, of the United States. And that was the book that was having a huge impact on young people. And our students, who were of the same age cohort as those who were reading Sayyid Qutb, never asked what they were reading and never read Sayyid Qutb, because we had simply declared that religion categorically was no longer important. So we ended up knowing nothing about the one area that in 1979 with the revolution in Iran becomes the key area.
It's interesting, we were having this conversation before class about what would be the break year between 1945 and 1991, and you said that you and your co-authors had suggested 1968.
Yeah.
And said, for your generation, that's meaningful. For us, we read Sayyid Qutb as, where you start with the Islamic world,
Yeah.
and 1979 has more meaning.
So you're right. It's when we debated where to break the chapters, and we agreed on 1991, and probably because we were all kind of oldish, and we couldn't agree on any date before that. Then the debate we suggested was 1968, the youth rebellions that you had in different parts of the world. 1979 was something we discussed, but then we thought it was too parochial because it dealt with the Iranian Revolution and Islamic Middle East. The idea that we would go from 79 down to, say, 2009, 50 years later, the Islamic presence would now be seen as a global phenomenon, and that you would have a hysteria about it building up comparable to the Red Scare hysteria that you had against Bolshevism earlier in the 20th century. That was unimaginable in 1979. Even when Islam came to be a source of humiliation for the United States, as it did with the hostage crisis in Iran, even then, that was not ascribed to Islam. That was ascribed to those Shiite Iranians who were not real Muslims. real Muslims were Sunni Muslims, and Sunni Muslims were peaceful people, whereas it was the Shiites who were suicidal fanatics. This was said over and over and over and over again, that 90% of Muslims were Sunnis and therefore peaceful, and 10% were Shiites, and most of those were Iranians, and they are horrible fanatics, and they are an enemy. Now we have Islamophobia, projecting the idea that Islam as a religion is a religion of pedophiles and wife beaters and gruesome sinners, hand hackers and so forth, by definition. So in a sense, what I'm trying to suggest here is that over time, Islam becomes a bigger and bigger enemy. Not that there's a whole lot changing, but the conceptualization of it grows bigger and bigger. Whereas the conceptualization of the communist menace grows bigger and bigger from World War I on until it becomes a vast world-girdling conspiracy in the Cold War period, which all makes me very apprehensive about the future of relations between America and the Muslim world, but that's for the future to determine. But what I'm really interested in here is, why did American thinkers decide that they could understand everything? And I think it was because they had defeated the Nazis. We had a world war and we won, and they lost, and we won because we're smarter, we're better, et cetera, et cetera. And they felt that everything now could be understood, particularly by those people who had served in the spy service during the war, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, who became the founders of the CIA and other intelligence agencies that made it crucial to expand the notion of American presence in the world as a whole. One of the first CIA agents to be lost was a scholar whose specialty was on medieval Islam. His name was Daniel Dennett. He wrote a book that still is considered a significant monograph called Conversion in the Poll Tax in Early Islam, and had a PhD in Islamic studies, and he ended up in the CIA and was lost over, I believe, Ethiopia on an unauthorized mission, and then his mission compatriots back in Beirut had to invent a story to cover up the fact that he was there. Basically, I think, just because he'd never been to Ethiopia and he thought it'd be cool to go there. But there was a very strong element of amateurishness in the early days of the CIA, which has now been overcome by a very strong feeling of bureaucracy. Why did the United States do this?
There was no one else
There was no one else to do what?
to run the world.
To run the world. But the idea that the world had to be run is so bizarre. Now, it really is, in a sense, the equivalent of what Victorian Britain thought, that the world was run by England, and all for the best, because nothing could be better than Victorian England, except in all of the particular details that we now point to as being horrible. But the idea that somebody had to run the world is, it's anomalous. It rarely occurs. I think the Romans thought somebody had to run the world. There certainly is a strong thread in Chinese history the idea of the Middle Kingdom, that all the North and East and South and West barbarians report and have tribute relations to the Middle Kingdom, is a sort of running the world phenomenon. But it's not a necessity. The world actually is capable of running without somebody at the helm. And I think this is one of the issues that we're running into over the next, or the coming years in the United States, is does the United States need to run the world? Or is it time to sit back and say, let the world run itself and develop multiple poles instead of a bipolar phenomenon? So when you see the clash of civilizations arguments and the Islamophobia and the efforts to say it's us against them on the one hand, then you balance them against visions that say, well, maybe the U.S. should have a more modest role in the world, and not get so upset if you have India and China and Brazil and who knows where rising to share the eminence that we once had. The problem with this is that it has, just as the British Empire was at its peak under Queen Victoria, when Britain loses the empire, what do they have to substitute for it? Soccer hooliganism, the Falkland Islands War as kind of the cartoon short subject at the end of the show. I mean, the mental and intellectual impact of stepping down from empire is very difficult to assess. But we can see countries that have suffered that. Rome, it's not clear that Rome had to disappear. That is to say, Latin might have continued, things might have continued, but it didn't. We still don't have a very clear notion of exactly why Roman civilization disappears, or many other civilizations. But certainly the sense of coming to the end of something is not simply a matter of describing a political or a military and economic situation. It's also a matter of assessing the psychological, emotional, intellectual impact of stepping down from the helm. And I started by talking about, was it inevitable that the West would rise? Well, what's the West? Obviously, it means us. Then the question of, is it inevitable that China will rise? Well, one final thought would go back to Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, the Untergang des Abendlandes. And the question is it inevitable that the West will decline? And taking the notion of counterfactual history, is there anything that could be done that would prevent the West from declining? Now, if you answer a nuclear attack on Iran, I won't be very happy, but you could make that argument, I suppose. But
our economic influence, the role of the dollar.
Economic influence, the role of the dollar, the role of the renminbi, which is the support for the dollar. It's a difficult argument to make. In any case, I have great doubts about the long-term durability of the Cold War as a structuring element in history, although as a great myth, I think it has legs. On Tuesday, I'm going to devote my lecture to talking about human-animal relations. This is a...
Bring my pet in?
No, you cannot bring your pet in. This is a area of intense interest for me, in which I think we are at the dawn of a new era, and I want to explain that because I don't think I will ever teach my course on history of domestic animals again. And then on Thursday next week, which will be the last lecture, I will try and cobble together some general thoughts about world history and how to teach it.